Hello everybody, Mrs. Bowen here. Actually going to continue learning about Standard 28, surface area and volume of rectangular prisms and cubes. The PDF that we'll be using is actually called Algebra Practice because we're going to use the skills that you learned last year in algebra. Our directions today say given the surface area of each rectangular prism, meaning we're going to have to use that formula we learned on our notes for rectangular prisms, we're being asked to find the missing edge length. So the first thing that you should always do is refer to your figure. So when I look at my rectangular prism here, right away I see I have a question mark. This is the edge length or the side length that I'm being asked to find. So we should probably label our figure. In our notes, we learned that there's three different ways to label the sides: length, width, and height. So the way I would probably look at this figure is that I have, say, a sheet of paper on the top of my figure. So if I was just wanting to find the area of that top piece of paper, we learned that we would do length times width. So the 10 meters can be my length, the 2 meters can be my width. And then it is being stacked this many times. So I would view that question mark as my height, meaning my length times width would be the sheet of paper at the top, and it's being stacked this much for my height. In my problem then, I'm going to be trying to find the height, which is what I'm labeling the question mark. If you labeled the question mark length or width, that is fine too. You're always going to be finding just one variable. So whatever variable you have labeled as your question mark, that's what you're trying to find. All right, so we've labeled our figure. The next thing we need to do is write the formula that we learned for surface area of a rectangular prism. So I would have your notes out. The formula that we learned is that surface area, capital SA, equals 2 length times width plus 2 width times height plus 2 length times height. So there's the formula that we learned. We have our formula, we've labeled our figure. The next thing we need to do is plug in all of these variables into our formula. So the first thing that I can actually plug in is my surface area, because here this example tells me that my surface area is equal to 208 square meters. So I'm going to plug in this 208 for my surface area. So I will have 208 equals 2 times my length. And if I refer to my figure, I labeled my length as the 10 meters here. So I'm going to plug in 10 anywhere where I labeled length times my width right here. And if I refer to my figure, I labeled my width as the 2 meters, meaning I'm going to plug in 2 anywhere where I see a W in my formula. And I will continue on. So I did the first part. I have 2 more chunks I have to fill in. So plus 2 times my width, we said, is 2. Again, I'm getting that from the figure. Times my height. We don't know our height. When we refer over here to our figure, our height is unknown. We labeled it with a question mark. So you could put a question mark. I'm just going to leave it as an H, meaning that's the variable that I have to find. I don't know my height. If you labeled it as width or length, then you would be putting a W or an L. That would be the variable that you don't know. So maybe you would have had a variable in another part of this equation. That would be fine. But whatever you labeled your question mark, you obviously don't have a number to plug in there. So when you're filling in to your formula, you'll just leave the letter. And then for my last piece, 2 times my length from the figure, we said was 10. And then last piece times my height, which we don't know, I will label it H. So here I have plugged in all of the parts to my figure. Yep, sometimes using color is helpful to see where the different pieces are coming from. The next thing that we need to do is simplify this. Here we have 2 times 10 times 2, and this is where you could pull your calculator out. You could use your phone calculator, or on Schoology, I posted a Desmos scientific calculator that I really like to use. You could feel free to use that, but we definitely need to simplify this. Anytime you see parentheses, right, that's indicating multiplication. So we have 208 equals 2 times 10 times 2 gives us 40 plus 2 times 2 times our height. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. We have to keep that h there, so it will just be 4h, 4 times my height, plus 2 times 10 times my height. 2 times 10 is 20, and then we still have to leave our h there. This is called algebra practice because you have done plenty of solving equations like this in Algebra 1. So the next thing you need to do, we took care of all these pieces of multiplication. Now we have to combine like terms. Combine like terms meaning I have a 4h and a 20h. These would both be called variable terms. You can combine your like terms. So now I have 208 equals, I can't combine the 40 with it. The 40 is a constant term, so the 40 has to stay by itself, but I can combine 4h plus 20h to get 24h. We're getting closer. We're trying to find h, right? H is our question mark, our unknown side, our edge length that we have to find. So think back, if I'm trying to solve this equation and I want to isolate h, the next thing I would do would be subtract 40 from each side because I'm trying to move that 40 over. So when I do 208 minus 40, I get 168 equals, and I'm left with 24h. And then my last step, if this is 24 times h, keep in mind that's implied multiplication when you have a number next to a variable. So your last step would be to divide by 24 on each side. And then we finally get our h, our height alone. And when I do 168 divided by 24, I get 7. The only thing I'm missing here by saying height equals 7 are units. So you have to look back to the problem to determine what are your units. When I look at the problem, I was given surface area, square meters, but on the figure for the length, width, and height, these are just regular units. So because my length and width use units of meters, that means my height will also use units of meters. So my final answer is that my height is equal to 7 meters. If, again, you labeled your question mark as, say, your length, then your final answer would be length equals 7 meters. Or you could say question mark equals 7 meters. Whatever you labeled your unknown or your missing edge length as, that's the piece that you found. All right, so this was one example. Working backwards, when given surface area of a rectangular prism, how could you find a missing question mark, a missing side length? The second example from this front page is still working with a rectangular prism, but now you're given volume. So we're going to set it up the same way. The first thing you should do is look at your figure, label your figure. So I would probably view it as, here I have like a top piece of paper. So that's my length and my width. And then this top piece of paper is being stacked this many times, which is my question mark. Since we have a rectangular prism and we are given the volume, let's write that formula. So on our note sheet, we learned that the volume is equal to length times width times height. So much easier formula than the surface area formula. Labeled our figure, we have our formula in front of us. So now we plug and chug, we plug in what we know. So I am given my volume. The volume is equal to 484 cubic meters. So I can plug in 484 for my volume right here. Equals my length. If I refer to the figure, my length here I labeled as 11 meters. So plug in 11 for our length. My width, I labeled in the figure as 4 meters, so I can plug in 4 for my width. This is multiplication, length times width times height. So I like to use parentheses when I'm indicating multiplication. You could also put a multiplication sign there if you wanted to, but make sure you know that it's not 11.4 or it's not 114. This is 11 times 4. So make sure that you do have multiplication represented there. And then the last piece is my height. And if I look at my figure, the way I labeled it, my height is my question mark. That's what I'm trying to find. So I can label that as H. This is my unknown. Now I'm doing algebra from last year where I need to isolate H. So I can simplify. I still have 484 equals. I can do 11 times 4 to get 44H. And then my last step, because this is multiplication, would be divide by 44 on both sides. And then I get my final answer. I would have that my height is equal to, and when I do 484 divided by 44, I get 11. And then don't forget units. So when you go back to your figure, because my length and width used meters, my height is also in meters. So final answer here would be that my height, or this missing question mark, is 11 meters. So we did 2 examples for when you're given a rectangular prism and you have to work backwards to find the missing edge length. And now we will do 2 examples when you have a cube and you have to work backwards to find the missing edge length. So we will do a surface area example. So when we take a look at this example, the top one on the back side of our algebra practice page, we can see that we don't have any measurements on this cube. And that's because if the figure is a cube, all of the side lengths have to be the same. So that's what we're trying to find, is what is the length, the edge length or the side length. I often like to refer to that as S, right? Every single side here, we could call it S, it has to have the same measurement. So there's not much to label on the figure for the cube. So we can start with our formula for surface area of a cube. And on our guided notes, we learned that surface area of a cube is 6s squared. So there's our formula. We have our formula, we have our figure. So the next thing we can do is plug in to our formula. And the only thing that we know that we can plug in here is our surface area. The problem tells us that our surface area is 486 square meters. So that's what I can plug in for my surface area. So I'll go ahead and plug in 486 for the surface area. But besides that, I don't have anything else that I can plug in. The S is my variable, which is good because we can only have one variable here when we're solving. So now I'm trying to get S, my variable, my unknown side length, all by itself. So this reads 6 times S squared, and you have to think back to Algebra 1 and order of operations using inverse operations to get this variable by itself. Because this is 6 times it, we want to first divide by 6 on both sides to move that 6 out of the way. So on the right, I still have S squared. 486 divided by 6 gives me 81. And I'm almost done. I want to know what is the side length. I don't want the side length squared. So last trimester, we learned that when we want to undo something raised to the second power, we take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root undoes the squared. That would give us our S by itself. A lot of us can probably take the square root of 81 in our head, but if you can't, I'm using a TI-84 calculator, and the square root button is right here. You have to click second, and then it's the X squared button. Or if you're using your phone calculator, I know there's a square root button. The Desmos scientific calculator that I linked on Schoology also has it. But here I'm taking the square root of 81, and we can see that I get 9. So my side length is 9, but I have to figure out what are my units. When you look at your cube, there are actually no units on the cube. However, there is still a way to figure out what the units should be. The way you know is surface area was square meters. So if the surface area is square meters, that means every single side, the units have to match up. It would just be meters. Again, it's just a side length, so it's not meters squared. So our answer would be that our side length is 9 meters. Very last example. We have another cube, but now we are given the volume. So again, we're using formula for a cube. We look at our figure. We don't have much to identify. I'm going to say that my question mark is the side length that I'm trying to find. And I need to write my formula for volume of a cube. We learned that volume of a cube is the side cubed. So let's plug in what we know. The problem tells us that we have a volume that we can plug in. Our volume is 1,000 cubic miles. So that's what I'm going to plug in for my volume here. So I can plug in 1,000 for my volume. Again, I have nothing to plug in for S. S is my unknown. That's what I'm trying to find. So I will still write S cubed here. And I'm almost done. This is S to the third power. I need to undo this S cubed. And the way I undo it is not by taking the square root, but by taking the cube root. So kind of like how in our previous example, to undo S squared, you take the square root. Here to undo S cubed, we take the cube root. And then that would give us our side length all by itself. In your calculator, if you're using, say, a TI-84 calculator like me, you actually have to click on the math button. And then it brings up some options. And on my calculator, it's actually the fourth one down for cube root. So it looks like the square root, but there's a little 3 floating out in front of it, showing that it's not the square root. We're actually taking the cube root. So I'm taking the cube root of 1,000, and I get 10. Another way of thinking about that, 10 times 10 times 10 gives me 1,000. If you're using the decimals calculator, there is this cube root button. So just be very careful. Make sure you are taking the cube root, not the square root for volume here. And then I need some units on this. So when I look at my figure, there are no units on my cube. But when I look up here at the example, it was cubic miles. So then my unit, if it's just the side length, would have to be just the unit by itself, just plain units. So it would just be 10 miles. At this time, we've done 4 examples from this page, and all 4 of these examples, the answers are actually at the very bottom of the page where it says random answers. So for like the 2 on this side, we had a 9 and a 10 as an answer. That means you could go to the bottom of your page and you could cross off a 9 and a 10. You now have 16 you-try problems. And so once you cross off your 4 example answers, there will still be 16 random answers left. And so each answer will be used 1 time. So at this time, you should try these 16 problems for practice. And you'll know that you get them correct because every single answer choice will be crossed off once. If you want to see the steps, like step-by-step breakdown of how to do a problem, if you get stuck or you're not sure how to label a figure, you can go to Schoology, and I do have the answer key for all 16 of these problems up there as a picture.